If you clicked on this video, you want to know if the Iron 883 is a good beginner or entry-level bike. And the answer is So I bought this bike as a new rider, never having owned a motorcycle before, and I did a lot of research on what would be a good bike. I decided on the Iron 883. This is a 2022, and I have just over 1,650 miles on this bike so far. The Sportster line of Harley Davidsons has been around for decades, and unfortunately production has come to an end in 2022. So this bike right here is actually the last year that they're going to be producing these Sportsters. You can still find some new old stock of the 2022s, but before too long you're not going to be able to buy any more new ones. But the used market on these bikes are still huge. If you don't want to pay the price for a new bike, which most people don't want to do if it's their first motorcycle, you do have the option of purchasing these at a deeply discounted price used through somebody that's had it or may have outgrown it as well. And as I said, I did pick this out as my first bike. I am to the point to where I have outgrown it and have actually trading this bike in for a lowrider ST, which will be coming later on this week. So this will be one of the last few videos that I have of this Iron 883. For it being around as long as it has, the aftermarket support for this bike is huge. So you can basically take this bike and do anything you want to it. You can customize it to your own. You can add power, comfort, style, tons of things with this bike, which is one thing that helped me decide on getting this as my first bike, is because, you know, the stock look of this bike, and especially any Harley, isn't the best. So there's definitely so you definitely want to add on aftermarket parts, especially the exhaust. I did put the stock exhaust back on this bike. If you can't tell, I did have the Reinhardt slip-ons in all my other videos, but since I'm trading this in, I went ahead and put the stock exhaust back on. So this is what it sounds like with that sewing machine of a stock exhaust. Now, if you are over 6 feet tall, you may feel cramped up on this bike, but because of the aftermarket support, you can get longer controls on this bike to fit you if you are a little taller and don't like these mid controls. So here's a look at the 2022 Iron 883 that I bought as my first bike. I've done a few upgrades to it and we'll go over those, but I'm kind of in the process of going back to stock because I'm going to trade it in. But this is what the bike looks like, and what makes this a great entry-level bike or somebody getting into motorcycles, learning how to ride, is how small and nimble it is. Most other Harleys and other bikes have much larger gas tanks. This one has a 3.5 gallon tank that they call the peanut tank, so it is much smaller and not as wide as the other ones. So when you get on this bike, to me it felt a lot more comfortable and didn't seem as big of a bike as the other ones and kind of as intimidating. So I think that having that smaller frame on this bike definitely makes it easier for a new rider to control this bike and feel like you have control over it. Another good thing about the Sportster is the mid controls. For me at 5'10", those feel really good. My knees are bent almost at a 90-degree angle, and with it being the mid controls, I feel like I get a lot more control over the bike. But if you are somebody that's a little bit taller that feels a little scrunched up with the mid controls, you can have forward controls that put on here, and they come out to about right here to give you a little bit more leg room so your knees aren't so high on the bike. Now this is one of Harley's entry-level bikes that they have. Even though they're no longer making these, there aren't too many other Harleys that are smaller. At one point they had the Street 500s. A lot of times you'll get those if you take the MSF rider course through Harley, but those aren't available to the public anymore. So this is pretty much the entry-level Harley that you'll see available out there today. Another benefit of this bike compared to some of the other Harleys and other manufacturers is the cost on this bike. It is one of the least expensive bikes on the Harley Davidson lineup, even though it's still not cheap if you buy it new. In 2022 I paid about $12,000 for this bike brand new, which is definitely higher than it used to be. This bike has Harley's Evo V-twin engine, which this is obviously going to be the last year that they're making this engine because it is the air cooled and everybody's trying to introduce new technology. So even though this engine has been around for decades, this is the last year of this Evo engine. And for a new rider, I think it's good because it only has 54 horsepower and about a little over 54 foot-pounds of torque. So when you're trying to learn, if you pull back on that throttle, it's not going to feel too torquey and push you back or anything like that. You're not going to have a lot of horsepower in a stock setup, so you're going to be able to have a little bit more forgiveness on the throttle than if you buy one of the bigger engines, say in like even the low riders that are really torquey. If you accidentally pull back on that throttle too much, you're going to get pulled back pretty hard on those bikes, and that's not a huge issue on this bike. So while having that smaller engine is a good thing for a beginner, you will tend to outgrow that pretty quickly, especially the more comfortable you get on this bike. You'll notice that you're wanting more power and to get up to speed faster. And the good thing about this bike is there are so many aftermarket parts that you can do to add power to this engine. You can go through the 4 stages that Harley has, which can get expensive, but most people at least do the stage 1, which changes the air cleaner, the exhaust system, and then adding a tune. And that will really kind of open up the bike, because right now with the EPA standards, the bike is pretty limited to where it's at, but even doing the stage 1 will kind of wake this bike up for you. Now with this being the 883cc engine, that is the most that you get stock, but they do make aftermarket kits to where you can upgrade it to 1200, 1250, or even 1275cc. Now that does get expensive with labor and everything like that, so that is something to consider as well. But the handling of this motorcycle, even if you are on the stock setup, is really good. The bike feels really nimble. You feel like you have a lot of control over it. It's not too heavy. I think wet it weighs a little over 550 pounds, like 564 with a full tank of gas, give or take. So not light, but definitely one of the lightest bikes that Harley makes. So you don't really feel that weight when you're at a stop or anything like that. It does make it easier to maneuver around as well, and you don't feel overwhelmed with the heavy bike. Now one thing you will notice on the stock setup of this bike is there is no storage room. I did add a sissy bar and added this bag and then the side saddle bag right here just so I can carry stuff around and do some errands, but as a bone stock bike you don't get those, so there's really nowhere to put anything. You can get an aftermarket phone mount if you want to use GPS, but keep that in mind. If you do want some storage, you will have to get some sort of saddle bag or sissy bar bag to allow you to carry things. One thing I do recommend if you are learning how to ride a motorcycle is get some sort of engine guard or crash bar. That way, in case you do drop your bike, you're not damaging any of the important expensive parts of the engine. You'll see I have the Harley Davidson Mustache engine guard that I put on here right away. That was one of the first things I did just because I was learning how to ride, and you always hear that you're going to drop your bike. Luckily, knock on wood, I haven't yet, but I definitely recommend putting some sort of engine guard on your bike. The controls on this bike are pretty simple. You do have the mid controls for the foot. So this right here is your rear brake. And then on this side, you have your shifter. The handlebars on this bike are pretty simple, and they're kind of all the same with all Harley models. You do have your clutch on the left side, and then your front brake on the right side. And then also on the right side, your throttle is right here, so it gives you gas. And then you have your on and off switch right here. So if you switch this to on, turns the fuel pump on. You have your hazard right here, and then this button right here starts the bike. And then when you want to turn off the bike, you just hit this cutoff switch right here, and it turns the bike off. You have your right side blinker right here, and then on the left side handlebars, you have your left side blinker right here. So some people love that, some people hate it. Doesn't bother me, I'm used to that. Over here, you have your brights, and then you also have your horn, which sounds pretty silly, but whatever. And then you have this right here, which helps you scroll through your menu on your speedometer. So you'll see you'll go through the mileage on the bike, trip A, trip B, you have your clock, and then also you have your gears, so you know what RPMs you're running, and it'll also show you what gear you're in. I tend to keep it on this because you can't see your RPMs on here, it just shows your speed. So I like having the gear and RPMs selected down here in the digital display. Also along this bar, you have a setup where it shows your turn signals if they're on, and these are auto canceling, so if you leave them on for more than 20 seconds, they will auto shut off. So you have an oil light, your neutral light, go ahead and kick that into neutral, right there, and then you have your brights, and then your other turn signal light. So pretty much everything you need and nothing you don't on this bike. One thing I like about the location of this gauge here is you don't really have to take your eyes off the road to look and see how fast you're going or what gear you're in. It's all right in front of you. One thing that is kind of difficult on these bikes, and I've heard a lot of people struggle with that, is finding neutral. So to find neutral, you pull in your clutch. Right now I'm in first gear, so you have to kind of do a half a click up, and then you're in neutral, and then to go back in first, it's down. So the gears on this, it is a 5-speed transmission. You have your first gear, neutral, second, third, fourth, and fifth. Now only having 5 gears on the motorcycle makes it kind of not so fun if you are driving on the highway at higher speeds. You're stuck with that 5th gear, and so the higher you go in 5th gear, your RPMs are going to go up. If you have a loud exhaust, that's just drone sound is going to get pretty loud. Also on the front of the bike, you have your turn signals and your headlamp. Those are one things that I do highly recommend replacing. This stock headlamp on these bikes really sucks at night. You really can't even tell it's on. I put a cheap Amazon one, I think it was like 40 bucks. The Wizamic LED headlight. I'll post a link to that video up here, but that literally made a night and day difference as far as being able to ride at night. So let's talk about comfort on this bike. It is made for riding around town, so on your quick under-hour rides, not too bad. The shocks on this bike are adjustable, so they are set to a certain preload. Check your manual, and depending on your rider weight with all your gear, you may have to make an adjustment, which is pretty easy just using these. The graph in the owner's manual will show you how many of these dots need to be shown depending on your weight. In order to change that, underneath your seat is the wrench that you need to move these. So to remove your seat, you just undo this one screw here, take off the seat, and underneath there is that wrench. So just make sure that is one thing you want to do, is make sure the preload is correct so you have a somewhat more comfortable ride. But I will tell you, even with this preload set to your rider weight, the stock shocks on this are super uncomfortable. You will feel every bump in the road, every crack. You definitely feel it in your lower back. There are a ton of different upgrades for the suspension on this bike, especially on the rear, that a lot of people do. But even those, I've heard it helps a little bit, but not perfect. So that is one thing on this bike, is the suspension. You are going to feel the bumps in the road, especially at higher speeds. You hit some of those big bumps and you definitely feel it. Also the stock seat, it's just got a foam insert. So I've been able to live with this one for the 1,600 miles I put on it, but it's definitely something I would have upgraded pretty soon. I think that was going to be one of my next things. It is pretty uncomfortable, especially since once that foam starts wearing in, but there are so many different aftermarket seats that you can get, and even get some 2-up seats, so you could potentially ride a passenger or have a backrest. Now you see I have the mirrors underneath the handlebars. That's because when they come stock, they will be up here, and for me, I couldn't see anything past my shoulder, so I just did a mirror flip, which I'll have a video up here. It's pretty easy. You just swap the mirrors, and put them underneath, so that way it gets you a little more visibility. Still not perfect, but a lot better than the stock setup. The brakes on this, especially on the front, is a single disc brake, which with this bike isn't a big deal because it doesn't have a whole lot of power, so you don't need dual disc brakes or anything like that. But keep in mind, this only comes with one single disc. And these old bikes do still take the keys, so I know a lot of the newer ones, like the Lowrider ST that I'm getting, has a key fob, so you no longer need a key, but this does come with the key. And also a fork lock, so you can lock the forks to help prevent it from getting stolen. And then just with the stock exhaust, it is pretty quiet. Again, I'll have some other videos up here where I put some slip-on mufflers, and if you do put on slip-on mufflers and don't do the full exhaust, you don't have to do a tune with these bikes or any bike that you just swap the mufflers on, and it'll still give you that rumble of a Harley. So my GoPro keeps overheating, so let's get back on the bike to maybe hopefully get some wind up on this GoPro to keep it from overheating. So see, just hit that on button, start the engine, let's go. So as somebody that didn't know anything about motorcycles or never ridden one before, even though this is a small bike, I was still very intimidated by it. You know, you're on two wheels, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And honestly, even though it was only 564 pounds, it still feels pretty heavy. But, and this goes for any bike, once you start the bike going, even in first gear or just in that friction zone, you don't feel that weight anymore. So I'll kind of go back down into first gear here and show you that, you know, even though I'm going super slow, I don't feel any weight of the bike at all. And just this bike being as small as it is makes it super easy to throw around. So I definitely recommend taking the MSF course, whether you do it through Harley or anybody else. They definitely get you comfortable maneuvering the bike at slow speeds, because that is one thing that takes some practice, is handling the bike at slow speeds. Once you get up and going, it's not an issue, but especially when you're in that friction zone doing U-turns, stuff like that, it's a little challenging until you get used to it. I mean, this bike is not really torquey at all. You pull the throttle back, I don't really get pushed back into my seat. For an experienced rider, you definitely like that torque, especially getting up to speed a lot faster. But as somebody that's a new rider, I think not having that torque and a lot of power is definitely something that makes it a little bit more comfortable to ride and gains your confidence. Another thing with the seating position is I'm a little forward. If I were to keep this bike, I would definitely want to raise the handlebars, because as you'll see, my arms are kind of lowered, so I'm sitting a little bit more forward. Not a huge issue for riding around town, but if I'm on the bike for more than an hour, I definitely start feeling it in my lower back. So that's another thing to consider, is the riding position depending on your height. And here are my knees. Again, I'm 5'10", and then this is how my knees sit on the bike. For me, it's pretty comfortable. And again, with these mid controls, I feel like I get a lot of control over the bike. I mean, you can just throw this thing around. See, I got the throttle all the way cranked and it's taken a minute to get up to speed. All right, so I'm in fourth gear and I'm gonna pull the throttle all the way back. I mean, you get a little bit pulled back in the seat, but nothing compared to like the Lowrider ST that I'm getting. So you don't feel like you're gonna get thrown off the back of the bike or anything like that. Good. This guy's turning, so that's good. All right, so we'll pull it back again. Again, this is all the way pulled back. It's taken forever. Shift up to fifth gear, all the way back. I mean, and it takes time to get up to speed. But that really made me more comfortable driving this bike. You know, when I was learning to ride in traffic, everything like that, definitely makes it feel like the bike is not going to get away from you. But even though I'm trading this bike in, I still, at the end of the day, really love and enjoy riding this bike. My thing was, and I've done a couple videos on it that I can post below, where you can check out the playlist, is everything that I want to do to the bike was going to be pretty expensive, and I could just upgrade to a lowrider for almost the same price for what I was wanting to get to it. So I'm not going to get into all that, but I will post a link to that video in case you guys are interested. But if I had the money, I would keep this one just to have, because it is really fun to just get out, rip around town in. Another thing to consider, since this is the Evo engine, this thing vibrates like crazy. So you do get a lot of vibration from the bike. One of the seat bolt that I showed you earlier, that vibrated right off. So it's not uncommon for things on this bike to come loose. It just happens because with this engine, it just vibrates like crazy and could vibrate loose. So it is one thing you do want to do every now and then, is check, especially like the important stuff. Make sure everything's tight every now and then. And then, since this is the air-cooled engine in the summertime like it is now, mid-afternoon, you feel that heat. This engine, you can kind of see it vibrating. Maybe, I don't know if the GoPro will pick that up, but it does vibrate and puts off a lot of heat. So since there's no air going in there to cool it off, you feel that heat in between your legs. So that's another thing to consider is, on these bikes, you definitely do feel that heat. Not a big deal while you're riding, but when you're sitting here in the summertime with the sun beaming on you and then the hot air coming off the engine, it gets real warm real quick. But then once you get up and going, get that wind on you, start to cool down a little bit. Our gas mileage on this thing isn't the best. I think it states on Harley's website you should get around 51. Round town riding, you're not going to get 51 miles per gallon. Again, this only holds 3.3 gallons. A little over 100 miles is when my gas light comes on, and I think you get 40 to 50 miles before it runs completely dry. I've never run it dry to see how many miles I get, but you will notice once you hit a little over 100 miles that gas light will come on. But not a big deal, especially if you're doing around town driving. There's plenty of gas stations around here, so that's not a big deal. Just makes it a little bit harder to do longer trips on this bike. If you do have it set up for like a highway, you're going to be stopping for gas a lot more than your buddies with the 5 or 6 gallon tanks. But probably for the best, because honestly, I don't know if I would want to go more than 150 miles at a time on this bike without stopping, because that will get uncomfortable and you just want to kind of get off and stretch anyway. If you do happen to buy this bike new, there is a break-in period, which I'm sure the dealership told you about, or you'll read in your manual. For the first 500 miles, you want to take it easy. You want to keep it off the highway, and then you don't want it to go over, like, it's either 3,200 or 3,500 RPMs, which isn't a big deal. But once that break-in period is over, then you can start having a lot more fun on the bike. But if you buy it used, you don't have to worry about that. And shifting on this bike, you hear that noticeable clunk as I'm shifting, so you know when this thing is in gear or changes gear, because you definitely hear that. And I don't know if you can hear my front brake squeaking. That is one thing that's pretty common on these bikes, is they do squeak. So if yours does squeak, it's annoying but not uncommon. See, I don't know if you could hear the audible click or clunk every time I shift. Yep, and you can hear it downshifting, so audible clicks when you're shifting, which is nice because you want to know, hey, am I in gear or not? And nice squeaky brakes. You know, it's funny going from that Reinhardt exhaust that is super crazy loud back to the stock exhaust. The noises of the engine and the shifting, you could just hear a lot better because, one, I don't have like noise canceling earbuds in just to help drown out the loudness of the mufflers. But yeah, you can definitely hear the noise from the engine and the shifting a lot more clear than you could with a loud exhaust. You can still feel and hear you shifting, but with the stock exhaust, it's way louder. But let's be honest, most of the Sportsters, especially if you buy them used, will have some sort of aftermarket exhaust, probably Vance & Hines, because that seems to be the most popular. So yes, I personally think this is a great bike for beginners or somebody that's getting into bikes. It's a great entry-level bike. Obviously, I'm going to have that opinion because I bought it as my first bike. But honestly, I don't think I would change anything. I don't think I would go to a different bike if I had to do it all over again. Now, it does suck having to upgrade to a bigger bike so soon, but I think had I started off on a bigger bike, I would have been a lot more intimidated and not gotten as comfortable as quick, because with my Lowrider ST, it's a lot bigger, a lot more power. So I think going with this bike, being a smaller bike, it was just able to get my confidence built up a lot quicker than I think I would have with the Lowrider ST, or even like a Street Bob, or you know, something like that. I definitely think this was a smart and good choice by me to go with this. Now, if I were to do it over again, I might not have bought one brand new. I might have found one on the used market, but I definitely still think I would have gone with the Sportster model from Harley. So I definitely don't regret getting this as my first bike. So hopefully this video helped you out in your research on deciding what bike is best for you. Is the Iron 883 a possibility? Would it fit your needs as a new rider or somebody just getting into, say, even just the cruiser style models? Maybe you're coming from a sport bike, whatever. Hopefully this helped you at least with a little bit of information on the Iron 883. If you guys watching also have any information, tips, or other bikes that you would recommend to anybody looking into getting their first bike, put it down in the comments. What was your first bike? Would you have done anything different? What was your experience, and any recommendations that you have? And smash that subscribe button so you can be notified when we come out with more content like this, and also when I'll be taking delivery of my new Lowrider ST. Thanks for watching.